We've been doing a podcast hosted by myself and Frederick Van Haren, along with others from the community, including Chris Grundeman and Andy Thurai, over the years. So for 3 years now, we've been doing a podcast. And one of the things that came up in the podcast is the question of bias. This is something that is extremely important when it comes to AI, because it's very easy to get algorithmic and programmatic and data-based bias into AI models. And those things can be very hard to get out and also very damaging. So for example, if you have a machine learning based system to evaluate mortgage applications and you feed it data from historic mortgage approvals, it's likely that it would systematically exclude certain groups of people because people excluded those groups of people. And similarly, if you had maybe an autonomous driving system or a face recognition system or something, it also would be biased based on the data that you've put into it and the data set. So for example, maybe your car can't drive in the snow, or maybe your car couldn't drive in a rural area where there are tractors on the road because it wouldn't know what that is. So we have to think about these things. And these are the questions that came up. And so in season 2 and 3 of utilizing AI, one of the fun things we used to do is we would ask the guests a question. And we would pick different questions. But one of our most favorite questions that we kept going back to was this one, which is it possible to create a truly unbiased AI system? And it was interesting because the more we posed that question, the more it became clear that our guests lined up almost in two camps, where one camp said, yes, it is absolutely possible. You just have to be very careful and control the data. And the other group said, no, it is absolutely not possible because you can never do that. And so that's the question that I have for our group here around the table. Is it possible to create a truly unbiased AI? And I'd like to have to kick this off actually with Karen, because you and I have had this conversation many times over the years. So here it is. What do you think? Is it possible to create a truly unbiased AI?
So I'm going to go with no, only because people are involved. And as much as we want to say we're not biased, I don't think it's true that humans can ever be completely unbiased because we work from our experiences. Now, the one exception could be if we could get an unbiased AI system to build an unbiased AI system, then maybe we could build. But I think you can see there's a chicken and the egg problem there. So I'm going to go with no, but only as purist as your question is.
Wait, what do you mean by unbiased?
Well, as I said, since the challenges of a biased system could result in all sorts of undesirable consequences, it means what it means. It's an absolutist question. Essentially, can you have a system that will not be affected by any of the human decisions, the irrational human decisions that we make? And like I said, it could be all sorts of things, like approving mortgages that include.
The challenge is the diversity of what exists in human existence. You know, if it's mortgages, there are plenty of mortgages that are given to people that are well off. There are plenty of mortgages that are given to people that are not well off. There are plenty of mortgages that are denied to people. You know, and there's bias to some extent in each one of those decisions. And how do you control for that in some sort of data set that you're using to train an AI model? That's the challenge.
Yeah, but that's kind of where my question's going, is to understand what you mean by unbiased. So because there's other things creeping in here about, bad. Like, so we have to define what badness is. And some of this is around, okay, are we talking just about the inputs in the data, or are we talking about the output, the outcome of a system? Because the purpose of a system is what it does. So what is the question you're actually answering? Because that's quite important. If we can't agree on what we're actually trying to do, then this is a fool's errand from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you can necessarily even define what you can't come up with an unbiased definition of what unbiased is.
I think you can.
I think you can as well. And I would say that from a sort of a platonic ideal, you want a system that implements the desired outcome in the best possible, with the best possible result. So whatever it is, right? You want your self-driving system to drive straight down the road, not bouncing off the sides. You know, you want your mortgage application to approve entirely based on the qualifications that you've set, not based on other things.
But again, I think you trying to define what is the best outcome is something that would not, I don't think that you can necessarily ask everybody here what the best outcome for some algorithm would be, and they'd all come up with the same answer.
I agree. I think
Thank you.
an interesting way of looking at it, I think, is artificial intelligence is there to simulate human intelligence almost. That's what we're trying to do. We get computers think like humans, and if humans
Better than human.
better than humans potentially, I'll accept that. But if humans are intrinsically biased, then are we not trying to model biased behavior?
That's the problem in a nutshell, right? I mean, if we're biased, then we're just going to make systems that are just like us, and we may not like those systems very much.
I think the other challenge with deep neural networks is it's really all about the data, Justin. So if the data is biased, then the algorithm, the model that makes those sorts of classifications or decisions are going to be biased as well. And we found this probably numerous times in various different models over the years that, you know, the bias was not necessarily intentional, but because the data is gathered in a fashion that, you know, enhances one aspect or one social group versus another, the decisions that are made by the models that are trained with that data are biased, and that's the challenge that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, I have a couple of issues with that. One is that the purpose of a system is what it does. Okay, you didn't intend for it. Okay, cool. The difference between murder and manslaughter is intent, but the victim is still dead. So I don't care that you didn't mean it if the computer you built killed someone, because it still killed someone. But I also think it's like this is kind of not actually a very interesting question. I mean, it's interesting philosophically, but it's not actually very useful, because I think we should probably reframe what we're trying to do rather than trying to make computers better than humans. It's like, well, let's actually look at the outcome we're trying to achieve, because we have experience with other non-human intelligences. They're called dogs and horses and cats. You know, we have coexisted and used and been in partnership with non-human intelligences for thousands of years. But we don't expect a dog to reason like a human. They have a much more narrow task when we bring them into conjunction with ourselves. But we have basically no control over how that intelligence is trained, or we have some control, but it's limited. We don't have a lot of control over the inputs that go into the system or how its internal reasoning happens. We don't even understand really how the mind of a dog works, but we are still able to participate with dogs and you know, use them in ways that we as humans find useful, that happen to also be beneficial for the animals. I think that's probably a more interesting way. Like, why don't we design systems with that sort of outcome involved rather than tying ourselves in knots over this philosophical question?
I have,
Go ahead.
so my whole thing is, now we've wandered into this great philosophical question, which isn't going to help people using AI. I mean, it is important that we go way back and think about it. I think, you know, we've dealt with statistical bias long before we had AI. We tried to control for it. We tried to at least identify it so that we could now use the results of whatever statistics analyses we were doing in order to make sure that we weren't causing a lot of over harm by that. I'm not saying that's a perfect world, but you know, if we know our data is biased because we haven't collected any data about people over the age of 89, we just know about that skew and that bias in our data, then we could try to make sure that what we use any analyses of to not deal with people over some certain age or not make predictions. But if we wanted to use AI, let's say over our current mortgage customers, and we know that in the US, redlining happened so that whole groups of people and your current address are completely biased and skews against people who didn't live in a redlining district, we could develop a system that where everyone knows and that where we're trying to do it. Will it be perfect? No. And I think where you were going, Justin, is if we use AI to just in a black box do yes, no, you can have this mortgage, you can't have that mortgage, that's going to harm people. I know that, you know that, we know that. But if we use it as some sort of creditworthy score where we heavily weight how well you've paid your mortgage for the last 20 years versus where you grew up or where you live or where you work or what kind of car you drive or what kind of debt level you have right now, then we might get good results from it. But I think it's kind of too philosophical to expect no IT system to ever harm anybody. It's what I want. I just want to be more practical about it and put safeguards in.
How many people should the system be allowed to kill?
Well, so the whole thing is systems kill people all the time today without AI. We allow it. And I'm not saying I'm a fan of that, but our systems are a product of us. So autonomous cars have killed people. Should there be no autonomous cars? Because drivered cars kill many more people. So I think setting this goal of never harming or killing someone, we would have no systems at all.
So with the Tesla Model 3, I've been thinking about autonomous driving for over 30 years, all the way from grad school days where I had infrared detectors looking at my eyes, seeing where I'm looking at a computer screen and seeing how I get around the world. So all the way back to then, I was thinking about, wow, could we make cars safer if we only knew what the driver's doing while they're driving, as well as a car that can actually see the road, those two things together. So flash forward to today, and it's really exciting to see the dawn of that in a practical use case. That is, how do I get my family, myself, from point A to point B more safely? My wife and I have both been hit by drunk drivers at high speed, rear-ended with their headlights off. There was nothing we could do about it. Changes your life forever, your perspective. That's your number one shopping feature in a car. How do I get from point A to point B more safely in the event of an accident for safety, as well as accident avoidance? That's the crucial thing. So my car has the optional, learning algorithms and full self-driving beta where I'm teaching the algorithm. Yeah, that sounds scary to people. I'm extremely attentive. I take over often. That helps the system learn a whole lot quicker if I intervene. I do not wait to see what the car is going to do and that kind of thing. There's a lot of people putting pretty boneheaded YouTube videos that freak everybody out. For me, the excitement, it's all about safety. So when I intervene and teach it to be a little smarter, my wife's base model, $38,000 Tesla Model 3 from 2.5 years ago, when they cost that, it can be smarter about accident avoidance in the future as well. She's got the same set of cameras. Her car will eventually get the same firmware and the same hardware 3 computer that runs at about 72 watts in the dashboard. That to me is the exciting angle, helping the whole fleet get safer. That's a whole lot less polarizing and scary than talking about self-driving. I'm not talking about robotaxi. I'm not talking about falling asleep. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the safety angle of those little nudges when you get near a line or someone falls asleep. You have a good shot at staying alive in that situation these days. So I'm an optimist about it. I'm well aware of the downsides as well and the creepy stories and the stuff that makes the press. So this is thorny areas we're getting into. And I'm almost nervous to do it, but I had about a 6-panel discussion with a bunch of full self-driving beta testers from all over New England back in the earlier days, October last year. That when it was more interesting. Right now there's 100,000 people. There's a lot of people on it now, but back then there was only a couple thousand. And sharing our experience in a new area of the country where the roads hadn't been seen before. It was mostly California drivers and Tesla employees in the early days. Now it was a wider rollout. The other aspect of the program that's been fun too is just seeing it grow up in those 6 or so months ever since, seeing the progress. Not as quick as most people would like, but and I don't use it all the time. But yeah, okay. So the thread I'd like to pull on more and hear other people's thoughts. That angle of, can the fleet be safer? Can we make cars that can intervene and avoid accidents a whole lot better than our increasingly distracted world that we all see every time you get in the highway with people looking down at their phones? I think the answer is yes, but I'm curious what other people think about that. It seems not hard to be the human at the game of driving, but there's a lot at stake.
I use the train. Some of this, like I can understand, and yes, it would be nice to make the cars safer, and we've done that historically as well with things like seatbelts, which the industry resisted quite vehemently for ages. But some of this is a bit of a failure of imagination, I think, because it's like, well, we'll just make a slightly faster horse. Like, that's, in an industry which prides itself on innovation and disruption and all this sort of stuff, it's like, what if we replace the cars with public transport?
That'd be great for Northern Canada. I'm saying that comes from a point of privilege. I know you know this, but I'm having to push back on that statement. There are just people, like thousands and millions of people who live in a place in wide, like even in parts of Australia, who will not have a train go within 100 miles, 100 kilometers of their homes. Like, I agree with that sentence. Let's not just make faster horses, but we can't say that a certain technology, public transportation, which I'm a fan of.
But I'm sort of going, I'm thinking more around systems design. So, and like there's sort of this drive for a local optimization. Go, well, okay, but what if we rethought and reframed this issue? Because what are we actually trying to achieve? And I think so. It is that framing of what is your objective, and are you over optimizing in a way, like you're designing the system and you're biasing the outcome of your AI to find an optimum way of approaching the problem, which has been underspecified. And we see this in a whole bunch of things. Computers come up with all sorts of crazy options for how to solve it that don't actually make a lot of sense.
And I actually agree with Justin here. I think that autonomous driving has turned into just a mental exercise for too many companies. It's just like there's a bunch of different companies that have decided that, oh, this is something that we should do, or here's an interesting problem that if we can solve it, we can make money at it. I don't think I'm the only person here who actually is an avid self-driver who enjoys driving, and
me too.
As enjoying driving, I really don't want a bunch of robots that are basically my rolling chicanes.
I think that's all right, and that's a great sentiment, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the vast majority of drivers are, to some extent, they're below average. They're not above average drivers.
Yeah.
By definition, half of them are going to be.
Yeah,
50%.
But it's actually more, I would say.
But I like that.
Perspective.
I like the safety aspects though. So when I say autonomous driving, I am really misusing that term. I don't mean get in my car, go to sleep and drive it to me at the airport. I mean, like where we're close to now with adaptive cruise and lane keeping assistance and automatic driver assistance. That's what I'm talking about. I want that to get 1,000,000 times smarter, but I also want a Toyota Tercel that everything's manual so that people who love driving can love driving and pay more insurance on a cheaper car.
Safety aspect.
Yeah.
If you could improve the safety of the average driver today, you would save thousands and countless lives over the course of the next 10 years, let alone next year or so.
I think we need to think about the ways that algorithms can hurt us. So let me get back to the podcast. So Frederick and I talked to a number of guests who have focused on this in academia, and some of the areas that they've brought up are obviously racial bias. Some of the other areas that they've brought up are, and in terms of racial bias, in terms of things like getting mortgages, but also in terms of just base functionality. And that's an important aspect as well. Most development of AI is happening in California and China. And if most of the data sets reflect where the development is happening, then that's inherently going to cause problems with these systems when they're used with people who look and act and dress and behave differently. And that's just how it is. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we had discussions about other things, other surprising aspects of bias in the data sets, religious bias, things like that. So the question really is back to, can we really build a system that doesn't include these biases? And the thing that occurs to me, the biggest challenge is that AI, or specifically deep learning, because of the way it works, you have to feed it a data set, it learns based on that data set, and it's reinforced based on that, and then you set it loose in the future. It means we're always driving using the rear view mirror. I'm sorry to bring driving back into it, but essentially, metaphorically speaking, we're always looking at the data that we've given it more than the data that it's seeing in the future.
I think the real challenge is that gathering data has always been difficult and an under-deserved type of profession. I mean, the challenge is if we want to have real, accurate, unbiased AI models, it all depends on the data, and the data has to be unbiased or representative, at least at a minimum. And to do that properly and to get it, properly annotated and correlated, it's an extremely difficult task. It's under it's under-deserved, it's underrepresented. It's just not necessarily well known that this is how it goes. I mean, you can grab data anytime you want. You go out to the web and grab thousands and thousands of images, but quite frankly, that's a biased sample.
Yes, and exactly. And as we heard as well, much of the categorization of that data is being done in sort of third world sweatshop environments where people may be encoding other types of bias into that data that we might not be aware of.
Yes, exactly.
I think there's another element as well to this. Even let's say you could find an unbiased data set. I think there's bias in the algorithm as well. So all AI algorithms are written generally with an objective, sorry. There's an objective of something we want to achieve, and that objective has bias in it. And you know, we want to achieve something through this model. That might not be the thing that really you should be achieving. And therefore, what we decide to do, like getting rid of outlying data points to make that model more accurate. What we mean by more accurate is more likely to give us a result we want it to achieve. And therefore, how many of those underlying data points we remove is going to change what that data. So you have two AI algorithms and you give it the same data set, you'll probably get two different, if they're written by completely different people, you get two different answers. And that's because there's even bias in the algorithm. Yeah. So it's not just data, it's also the algorithm. I think that's going to introduce bias.
Is one of the things I learned from our podcast is that we have to come up with a realistic expectation from AI, right? Expecting AI to be unbiased while people are biased. I mean, people that say that are unbiased, we all know it's not true. Everybody is biased. So what is the expectation from AI? And what I learned is that we expect AI to do a better job than people. It's not a binary bias versus unbiased. It is just an attempt at making things better. There are two components. The first one is the data collection. Obviously, if you start with data collection that is biased to a certain degree, left or right, that's clearly a problem. The other piece is also the algorithms. And I can give you an example. And then since everybody's talking about self-driving cars, I'm going to throw in a self-driving car example. Imagine that there is a school bus and a car with an elderly couple. There's one lane on each side. And so it's self-driving car. So data is being used to make decisions. Now, from an algorithm perspective, imagine that both AIs in the bus and the car are having a conversation, and eventually they realize there's going to be a collision, and based on certain bias, they might decide that the elderly couple has to go, and then the self-driving car drives your car off the bridge, which obviously is where the algorithm pushes or makes a decision that from a bias perspective makes sense for the algorithm, but it doesn't make sense from a human perspective. Also, in the human perspective, you might have a situation where both the school bus will have kids dying as well as in the car. And so I think from a realistic standpoint, it is very difficult to expect AI to be completely unbiased because there will always be some degree of bias. We can only expect that the bias in AI does a better job than what a human does. We also talk a little bit about people driving and being a good driver. Sure, most people are or maybe behave, but what happens at 3 a.m. when you have so much alcohol in you that you cause an accident? I mean, that's also something to consider, I believe. But anyways, so in a nutshell, I do believe that we should expect AI to do better than humans, but not to be perfect. I don't think perfection or completely unbiased is actually reality.
I'm going to say that, so what I remember your initial question was about is bias in like even the foundational data and the way we see the world. I'm paraphrasing it. But like one of the current biases that just drives me crazy right now is there are companies that you do business with every day right now who don't have systems that can accurately record anything about LGBTQ plus people. There are only two genders in their databases. Their applications only support two genders. They have constraints in their systems that only people of opposite genders can be married to each other. There are things that they put into their systems that everybody did since we collected data about humans, that they're biased, but they're wrong because people put constraints on them to try to make their data quality better. And they're still taking that data and bringing it into their AI systems. And they're coming out with conclusions that, well, we don't have a lot of gay customers, or we don't have anyone who has changed their gender. That is because they built constraints into their system that didn't allow it. And they are not capable, even though they think they are, of putting any type of automated learning or inference, or even doing reporting on these classes of people. And they're not going to spend any money to change it until somebody forces them to, either competition in the market or legislation and compliance. And there are examples like this across data sets. Everything we do has our original bias, our original send biases built into our data sets. And people working with data now, that data where those constraints were put in, have no idea just how biased that data is.
I don't actually think we want unbiased algorithms. I think yes, he is biased there, but I think that's what we want. And the thing is, we all want our own bias, and even if we want unbiased, that is a bias. It's our version of unbiased that we want, which is which maybe 10 years ago looks different to what we would say unbiased data looks like today, and will look different to what in 10 years time people think unbiased looks like. So it is a bias in itself. So I would challenge, I would say, I'm not sure, is unbiased wrong, I guess is what I'm thinking. I actually think what we want is biased data. We just want our version of biased data.
That's why I wanted to ask what people meant by bias, because we're getting into issues of justice, of like, we want to design the systems to have a different bias than the ones that the past data set that we have, what that has. But then we have to agree on what that future state looks like. And that's why we need to have these discussions about, well, what do we value? Who is important? And who gets to make these decisions?
That's different for everybody, right? Because if I ask you, you will say something. But if I ask someone who's a Muslim, he will probably say something different. And if I ask someone who is a Christian, they will say something different. And if I ask someone who, I don't know, is the spaghetti believer or something like that, he will say something different as well. So I think unbiased is just what everybody said. It's or not everybody, but it's something that it isn't unbiased. Everybody has something biased, and we will probably maybe somewhere in the future end up being in the middle, but that will take a long time.
And I think that really the challenge here is that we don't want people to just throw in the towel and say either, no, you can't have an unbiased system, or yes, you can, and the technologists will save us all. I think the ultimate answer is that we have to be vigilant against this all the time. And we can't just assume that the algorithms are going to be correct. Mm-hmm. We have to have people in the mix, and we have to have people judging things. And frankly, we have to accept the fact that the systems are going to reflect us and not the way that we wish the world was.
Well, I was trying to touch on this a few minutes ago, where, if you actually come up with what you consider an entirely unbiased system, use the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy example. So if your answer is 42, people are going to look at that and say, okay, what did you actually do to come up with that answer? And when you actually need to have the transactional accountability and the ability to actually show why the decision was made, people are going to review that and say, okay, so here's the answer we got. It's supposedly unbiased, but they're going to have a biased look at how the answer was derived.
So I guess let's kind of come to a conclusion here with those of us who are here. And I want to thank those of us who are not here, who are joining in as well. Is this the right question? is this the wrong question, or is this helpful?
42.
Yeah, okay, 42. We got a 42 answer. Who else wants to jump in with the answer to
the question is very accurate. The question is very needed. We need to have this sort of discussion about what's happening with the bias in these algorithms now. How do you address it is non-trivial. How do you get from where we are today to something that's better is not easy, but we need to make those steps. We need to have, considerate effort to try to get proper data, to try to get proper algorithms that do these sorts of things in a proper fashion, at least from quote unquote, the best unbiased view that we can. It's not simple. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to start taking the steps today to get there.
And yes, and we can't shy away from the difficulty. And some of it, so that I'm wary of the tendency in technology, particularly for optimism and kind of the this kind of a over optimistic way of doing things. The history of engineering is replete with failure. And there's a saying in various industries that regulations are first written in blood and then in ink. Usually we have to fail in pretty dramatic ways before we take into account the way failure can happen. But we have an opportunity here that if we think about it ahead of time, maybe we can avoid some of the mistakes that we've made in other industries as they've developed. Maybe if we think about it up front, we don't have to go through those periods of blood before we get to the ink and decide not to do things. It's an option to say, no, we won't build that thing because it's too dangerous. Or actually, you know what? Maybe we need to put in a lot more work before this thing is allowed to go out into the world. We need to make sure that it is safe to a certain degree. And we, as the people who build this stuff, we need to take that responsibility and not hide behind the ideas that technology is not biased, or it can be both good or evil, depends on who's using it. It's like, well, we're the ones who are building these things, so it's on us.
I don't think you can wish this away. It's going to happen whether we wish it or not, and it's not just me or America or China that's trying to create these solutions. It's everywhere, and ultimately, it's the best thing for the world. Is that this becomes a commodity. This AI capability is available to everybody and anybody to do things that can benefit society. But the challenge is we need to step back and at least take a look at this and say, are we going down the right path? Can we get better at this? And how do we get better at this? And what are the solutions? Because you can't stop technology. You can't. You can try to say no, but it's not going to happen.
And you meant to say capitalism, not technology,
No,
right?
I
No.
technology.
But my comment is I'm expanding on yours, that you can't stop the market. It's not, even though academia and governments are involved in all this, there's monetary motivation to get stuff to market fast. We know this. This is how the world works. And you can't just say, okay, no more AI because we might hurt people, because it's just not going to happen. So I'm agreeing with you, but expanding on what you're saying. The technology is not happening because people want to make it easier for people to drive. The technology is happening because there's a market for it.